Well everyone, the wait is over. Deadpool and Wolverine has finally released. And with this film's release, and it being the only Marvel film to release this year, and there won't be another one till next February, I figured what a better time to do a ranking of the MCU than now. Hello everybody, my name is Dustin, aka Drex, and welcome back and/or to the channel. Now, first off, I will not be going into deep analysis for each film and TV show and special that I will be ranking, as yes, I will be ranking all the movies, Disney Plus shows, and specials, but not in full depth, as I am under the assumption that you have seen them or at least are familiar enough with them to be watching a video with them being ranked. I will just give my brief highlights and why I placed them there. Also, this will not contain spoilers for Deadpool and Wolverine. I will just give my brief thoughts on it without spoiling anything. I also will not be including any TV shows that are not Disney Plus, so that includes all of the cable shows and Netflix shows. And I will not be including any Fox movies or Sony movies, just the official MCU movies, TV shows, and specials. However, by all Disney Plus shows, that has a bit of an asterisk to it, as I will not be covering I Am Groot, as that doesn't really have any story to it, it's just a series of shorts, or X-Men 97, which you may be thinking, yeah, duh, but it is placed on the Marvel timeline, so some people would consider it MCU canon, but I am not. With all out of the way, let's get into the ranking. In last place is She-Hulk Attorney at Law, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody. Now, I will give this show props. It does fit the TV show format better than like 90% of other Marvel shows, but the format it tries to go for is a comedy. But the problem is, it's not that funny. This show also probably has the worst finale of any of the shows, which, considering the finale of a lot of these shows, that is saying a lot. I mean, they're breaking the fourth wall in whatever the fuck this show does. It makes no sense and is just so damn stupid. There are so many ways to do what this show is trying to do and do it better, but this just isn't it. But the Daredevil stuff is cool, so it has that. Next up is The Eternals. Now, this movie doesn't have a bad concept, and in fact, if this was a TV show, probably would have worked pretty good and been one of the better Marvel TV shows. But, as a movie, it just has too much going on. It is the opposite of the Disney Plus shows, where most Disney Plus shows don't have much going on and just feel like they're stretching it out to get to the 6 episodes. This feels like they had a 10-episode story and decided to cram it into a 2.5-hour movie. All of this leads to a lot of the characters being pretty flat, a villain that is just a joke. Does anyone remember the name of this villain? I do. It's Crow. The name of the villain of the movie Eternals is Crow. You probably already forgot it because you probably don't even remember what he looks like. Combine all that, you get a movie that's only lasting impact on the MCU is being the first movie to have a rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes and introducing a plot point that is just now, a little over 3 years later, going to be followed up on in Brave New World. But aside from that, this movie is so skippable. The characters might not ever even return, and there's no plans for a sequel, so do yourself a favor, just watch a recap online if you haven't seen this movie. And third to last is Secret Invasion. Now, I am one of the people who thinks this show works in concept. Nick Fury having to be the ultimate spy that we all know he is, trying to stop a secret Skrull invasion, not being able to trust anyone, is pretty cool, but it is fumbled horribly in the execution. In this show, all about Nick Fury, they create the biggest sin of a mountain of sins that is the show, and that is they make Nick Fury seem incompetent. Put all that together with the fact that this really should have been the much needed 5th Avengers film before the final 2, before the end of the saga, really makes it clear why Marvel decided to overhaul how they do TV after this show came out. Up next, and the final bad thing on this list, is Echo. This show is just so boring and just pointless. The only good things in this show are Kingpin and the singular Daredevil scene. Aside from that, you can easily skip this show, and this show has such horrible pacing. Such bad pacing that they had to turn what was meant to be 6 episodes into 5 episodes, and release them all at the same time because they knew no one would watch this week to week. Okay, I would say everything from here on out is either passable to amazing. That being said, I think Black Widow is easily the worst of the good Marvel projects. This is a film that came out 5 years after the movie it is supposed to take place immediately after, which just so happens to also be 7 years before the current timeline, and not to mention, the character died in the last movie. This is just a movie that came out too late, and doesn't even have much to offer to make up for that fact. This film also gives Taskmaster the Deadpool from X-Men Origins treatment. The main character is the least interesting she's ever been, which, considering this is her last appearance, that's just not good. So that just makes this a pretty meh movie. The best part about this is the side characters, but they all could have been introduced somewhere else, so this movie doesn't really have a lot to offer. Up next, Thor: Love and Thunder. This movie has a similar problem to Secret Invasion. Good idea, bad execution. This movie has way too many jokes, but it is up this high because while most of those jokes don't land, there are a few that do land. And Gore, while he is very wasted, whenever he is on screen, he has done well. And Jane is definitely at her best in this, and Thor, well, at his worst probably. It's still always fun to see Thor. But this movie has a serious tone problem and not enough stakes for a movie with a villain called Gore the God Butcher. We have reached the first film of the Infinity Saga on this list, and that's Ant-Man and the Wasp. The reason this movie is so low is, well, first off, I've never been that big of a fan of Ant-Man. I like him, and he's good in all the movies, I just never got attached to him. I also am just not that big of a fan of the MCU's version of the Wasp, and I don't really like the side characters aside from Hank. This film also just has a very boring villain, and the plot doesn't really do much aside to set up a post-credit scene. But it did grace us with Jimmy Woo, so I guess that's why this movie's up this high. Okay, let's get this out of the way first. The only reason Captain Marvel is above the last movie is because of how funny Nick Fury is in this movie. Aside from that, this film is just pretty alright. I don't hate the character or the movie as much as some, but I'll admit it doesn't do much aside from set up the character and provide possible setup for Secret Invasion, which, as we have gone over, was wasted. Okay, my first hot take of this video, and there will be many, is I don't really like Miss Marvel. The only thing I really like in the show is Kamala herself, but aside from her, this show just feels very boring. But unlike all the other shows, this feels like it is 2 seasons worth, but was just crammed into one to set up the Marvels, but despite that, it is still somehow boring. Not too long ago, I would have said Iron Man 2 is way overhated, but for some reason, upon my most recent rewatch, I found myself not liking it as much as I used to. The big problem with this movie is that it is somehow overstuffed, but still boring. The first action scene doesn't happen for 30 minutes into the movie, then not too long after we get another action scene, and then we don't get another one until the final battle. That is probably due to the fact that for the entire movie, up until he is being fought, he doesn't know that the villains are even villains in this movie. Now, while Sam Rockwell is great as Justin Hammer, Whiplash is just wasted. Next up, I think might be a hot take, but I'm going to say it anyways. I don't think Thor 1 is that good. And up until Love and Thunder, I think it is by far the worst Thor movie. The first act in Asgard is good, but as soon as he gets to Earth, I lose all interest. The human characters aren't horrible, but they are far from good. While Thor, I think, does have a good arc, I do feel there is a way better way to do it that would be more interesting. Also, why the hell is like 25% of this movie sideways? Even Loki is pretty boring in this movie. In fact, I think he's at his worst here. I mean, he is still good and the best part of this movie, but something just seems subdued compared to all of his other appearances, where he just feels like he's holding back a little bit. Honestly, if Loki wasn't the villain in Avengers, I don't think he would have been that popular. So when you put all that together, you get a pretty meh movie. I have probably two hot takes in a row, and that is, I don't think Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumanium is that bad. And in fact, I kind of like this movie. I actually really like Kang as villain, with the exception of his 2 defeats in the movie. I think he was actually pretty threatening, and with what little time he had on screen, he definitely made the most of it. Cassie and Scott's relationship is nice, and this film can be pretty inventive in some areas. But the big flaw with this movie is the side character, and that is, I don't think they needed to be in the quantum realm with the exception of Hope, Scott, and Cassie. Honestly, I think this movie would have been better if it was just the 3 of them in the quantum realm and they didn't have Janet, who is an expert in it, along there with them. Maybe instead you could have had the rest of the side characters in the main world, bring in the other side characters from the first 2 movies. I know this has just turned more to a pitch than me just saying what I think about this movie, but that's really all I have to say about it. I just see the possibilities, but I do see why people do not like this movie, as the CGI does not look good, and Kang's defeats are kind of embarrassing. Wow, look at this, 3 hot takes in a row, as I am probably the biggest defender of the world of Thor: The Dark World, and I think it is a very big improvement over the first Thor. For starters, most of the human characters are sidelined for most of the movie, except for Jane, who is the only one who should have been in these movies to begin with. Thor actually has his powers the whole time. We spend pretty much the entire movie off of Earth, which, considering Thor is like the one Avenger who isn't human, is probably what he should be doing anyways, which means we get to see fun and interesting locations that we don't really else get to see, and Asgard is fleshed out a lot more in this movie and is actually really good. Sure, Malekith is one of the most disappointing villains in the MCU and is very forgettable, but that's really the worst thing I can say about this movie, is it doesn't really have a good villain. Sure, there are some aspects of this that can be boring, but I actually find this a really interesting watch, and once again, Loki is the MVP of this movie, like he is in most of his appearances. Okay, hear me out. The Incredible Hulk is the most slept-on movie of the MCU. I am one of the few people who think Edward Norton is a better Hulk and Bruce Banner than Mark Ruffalo. Hulk has the perfect balance of being a mindless beast, but also being centered in the fact that he wants to defend the ones he cares about. It also has the best Hulk-Banner dynamic, as Banner is really scared of the Hulk and doesn't want to become the Hulk at all costs. Unlike Ruffalo's Hulk, where, while he doesn't like becoming the Hulk, he will do it and isn't scared of it. So honestly, based off their first outings, I'd much have rather had 4 Hulk films than 4 Thor films. I'll keep this short. The Marvels is a short, harmless movie. The worst part about this movie is the villain, but she is just forgettable. This is a movie that does nothing good, but nothing bad. It is just overall okay. But I will say that this probably would work better as a third movie rather than a second. Up until recently, I would have put The Falcon and Winter Soldier way lower, but upon another viewing, I gotta say, this show really only has 2 major problems. Number 1, it has very weak villains, and in fact, probably the worst of the MCU, and number 2, this really should have just been a movie. With how big of a moment Sam becoming Captain America is, and how this show handles the blip, this would have been the perfect first film of the saga and aftermath after Endgame. And it also would have been able to eliminate much of the fat that was in this show. But aside from that, I think the show was pretty good. And it's definitely one of the better MCU TV shows after the time has passed. There was a time when I would have said Iron Man 3 is the worst MCU movie, but as the years have gone on and I've matured and also way worse movies have come out, I have grown kind of fond of this movie. While I do have problems with it and really don't like the Mandarin twist, it's not for the reason you think. While yes, I do like the Mandarin in the comics, it's not that they didn't follow the comics, as movie change things for adaptations all the time. It's the fact that they set up an amazing Mandarin in the fake Mandarin, and then they just swept that under the rug for a way worse and much more boring villain. But aside from the Mandarin twist, I think a lot of this movie is really good, and with Shang-Chi coming out and us getting the real Mandarin, this movie has gotten better with time. When Black Panther Wakanda Forever came out, I thought it was better than the first, but as time has gone on and I found myself rewatching the first a lot more, and not really the second one outside of MCU rewatches, I've come to the conclusion that it really isn't as good as I thought it was. This movie is just a lot to deal with. It has 2 funerals and the destruction of Wakanda, and I get that is the point. And considering the circumstances this movie was put in, with the passing of Chadwick Boseman, it is an amazing feat that it is this good. But it's this movie's strengths that are also its weaknesses. So, considering how little I find myself wanting to revisit this film, I can't put this any higher in good conscience. Next up, on the opposite side of the emotional spectrum, at least at first, is WandaVision. Similar to Falcon and Winter Soldier, I did not like this show at first, but again, as time has gone on, I have grown to like it a lot more. This definitely does the best job at feeling like a TV show out of all of the Disney Plus Marvel shows, and it also is a very fun watch, at least until the last 2 episodes, where it decides to make a complete and utter turn and become one of the saddest projects in the MCU. Honestly, I think this whole show is good until you get to the finale, where it does just kind of divulge into a laser battle in the sky like so much rest of the MCU, while the first 8 episodes of this show were so unique. But aside from that and the Quicksilver fake out, I think the show is very good. From what I hear, this is a very unpopular opinion, but I've never been that fond of Moon Knight. And it's not the last episode like most people have problems with, it's actually the first half of the show, particularly episode 3, which to this day I cannot remember anything from. I've rewatched the show quite recently, and aside from he dies and the ending, I do not remember what happened in that episode. I also don't really think it does a very good job at world building. It just establishes a bunch of things, but doesn't really show how it fits in with the established Marvel Universe. I mean, we are introduced to this whole new pantheon of gods and their avatars, but they don't do anything at all. And to top it all off, this show ends on a cliffhanger, which, like Eternals, might not ever get resolved. Okay, Werewolf by Night is one of the most distinctive projects in the MCU, and it is actually really good. That being said, I just think there are better projects in the MCU, so it comes in at 28. Ant-Man is by far the best solo Ant-Man movie. That is probably due to the fact that Edgar Wright worked on this movie for like 8 years before leaving, so most of what's in here is probably from his ideas. And I'm also a big fan of heist movies. This movie also has all of the side characters at their best, again probably due to Edgar Wright, and this is probably the one movie where I actually like Hope. The problem with this movie is the villain. He is just so bland and boring, which makes it even more questionable why the hell did they make him MODOK? But all that aside, I do think this movie is pretty fun. While it does play fast and loose with its own rules, it does have some creative action scenes as well. As someone who loves period pieces, the first Captain America movie was always going to be high up on my list. The problem with this movie is it has some very weird pacing. After Cap saves all the soldiers, it does a montage through like a year and a half of story. And it also kills off Bucky in a pretty weird way. But aside from that, I do think this movie is very good, as everything up till he saves soldiers is pretty flawless, and everything after Bucky dies is also pretty good. And this movie has one of the most unforgettable endings ever. However, the whole him waking up in the future does kind of feel like a post-credit scene, considering how the movie literally fades to black before it. Tied for the 25th and 24th spot respectively is both seasons of What If, and that's because they're basically both the same. While Season 1 has higher highs but lower lows, and Season 2 is just overall consistently okay, the main problem with this show that goes across both seasons is its weird choices for what ifs to do. Choices like, hey, what if Captain America was his love interest in the first movie? Or what if Star-Lord was Black Panther? Questions that no one was asking, instead of doing really cool stories that the internet has been coming up with for years. But overall, the stories it does tell are usually pretty good, but there's just baffling the decisions, so it's coming in around the middle of the list. Doctor Strange is one of the most visually creative movies in the entire MCU. Combine that with it being an origin story, and this movie feels like it was made for me. Where this movie falls flat, however, is like most Marvel movies, with the love interest and the villains. The villains are just kind of boring, aside from Dormammu, who's not really a character, he just serves for one really cool scene. But as for the love interest, she doesn't really do anything outside of one action scene, and it really feels like they didn't know what to do with her out of the opening. Also, this film sets up stuff that doesn't really get paid off. More do. So all that together, this film winds up here. The Multiverse of Madness does everything the first Doctor Strange does good, but with better side characters and that signature Sam Raimi flair. While this movie, you can feel all the Marvel aspects of it, Sam Raimi does bring more to this movie than pretty much any other director in the MCU does to their movies. The biggest problem that most people have with this movie is the multiverse stuff, but honestly, if you changed the title, then this movie would have been received a lot better. I really don't get the hate for it. I really like this movie. Just barely missing out the top 20 is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. This film is good, like all James Gunn comic book movies are, but this film is definitely the weakest of the bunch. This film just has too much going on. Each of the 3 acts has its own villain, so naturally, they don't really get a lot of development with the exception of Ego. I also don't really like how the Guardians spend most of the movie apart, and Yondu, while he is great in this movie, with how little time he spent with Peter in this one and how he was just trying to kill him pretty much the entire last movie, his sacrifice doesn't really hit as hard as it possibly could have otherwise. But at the end of the day, this is still a funny, emotional story, so it comes in at number 21. Just barely beating out Guardians Volume 2 and taking us into the top 20 is the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. This doesn't really do much, but it is just a fun little Christmas story with our characters and Kevin Bacon for some reason, so for that, it comes in at number 20. Now this might be a hot take, but I think Far From Home is the worst proper Spider-Man movie. Yet again, it's also coming in number 19, so clearly it isn't that bad. The reason for it being the worst is, like many others have said both before and after me, the plot just doesn't make sense. Why does Peter have Edith when he was dead up until the final battle of Endgame when Tony would have made his will? And for the second movie in a row, the bad guy is more mad at Iron Man than Spider-Man. But at the end of the day, this is still a Spider-Man film, and it does a lot great, aside from the Iron Man glasses. And it is neat seeing him in all the other countries. Up next is Black Panther. Now, if you had asked me my thoughts on this movie around last year, I would have told you that it wasn't that great. But as time has gone on and I've watched this movie more and more and reflected on it more, I have grown to really like this movie, enough to place it in the top 20. It tells a great story of father and son and how to be a good king, and it ties in Killmonger great into that, and Killmonger is just one of the best MCU villains, even today. Wakanda also is just a fun place to spend time in, and aside from the final battle, this movie visually just looks really good. But most things this film does good have been done better elsewhere. So with all that in mind, this is a fun film, but not the best. Probably my hottest take here is, I really don't think The Avengers is that good. First off, it doesn't really look that good, with most of the movie looking like a TV show with all the flat lighting. Most of the characters I feel are boiled down to their basic character trait. Tony is sarcastic, Cap is a Boy Scout, Thor is an alien Viking, Hulk is a monster, so on. It is even done to Loki, where I feel character-wise this is probably his worst outing, with him just being evil with no other greater purpose there. This film also does the Phantom Menace thing by having the entire bad guy army being defeated by blowing up the mothership. Also, this film basically invented, if not at least popularized, the giant blue laser in the sky that was everywhere in the 2010s. But all that said, it's still fun seeing all the characters together, and the action scenes, what little there are still very good. And it's also the first film of its kind to unite so many different franchises, so for that alone, this movie is going up relatively high. Okay, I think Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is probably the best character introduction to the multiverse saga. At least main character introduction in their own solo movie. It has good acting, a fresh new style of action with its Bruce Lee martial arts movies inspiration. It has fun characters, good world building, and plays off a near decade-long plot thread with finally introducing the actual Mandarin, who just so happens to be one of the best villains in the MCU with an amazing story. So all that put together, this film comes in the number 16 spot. Alright everyone, before we get into the top 15, I'd like to ask you to like, share, comment, subscribe, and as for the comment your own ranking, or if you don't feel like doing all 48 projects, maybe just do your top 5 or top 10, or just comment on what you think of my listing. But do be respectful to both my opinions and anyone else who's commenting opinions as well. Let's get back to the ranking. Oh, look at that, another hot take. And I'm noticing a pattern, as most of these seem to relate to the Disney Plus shows. Now, I think Hawkeye is actually really good. It gives Clint some actual character development, which he doesn't really get outside of most of the other movies, and it does a lot and deals with all of his PTSD and trauma from the last few Avengers movies very well. It also introduces Kate Bishop, who was just amazing, and brings back Yelena, who is hilarious, and her dynamic with Kate is amazing. It brings back Kingpin, and while most people feel he isn't that great in this show, I actually don't mind his small appearance, and it really is just a tease what's to come. This is also one of, if not one of the few Disney Plus shows where I actually want to see these characters again, and am really excited to see Kate Bishop in the Young Avengers whenever that ends up happening. Spider-Man Homecoming is probably one of the most uneven movies of Phase 3. It doesn't change the universe, it doesn't introduce any major characters, or make any major changes with the characters it does have in this movie, but that just makes it more impressive how it ends up beating most of Phase 3. This film is a fun Howard Hughes take on Spider-Man with not very high stakes, but still a very good villain in Michael Keaton's Vulture, who is honestly one of my favorites of all the Spider-Man movies. And while people do complain that Spidey feels more like Iron Boy Jr., I feel this movie does a good job of saying, no, he isn't. Granted, that's kind of taken away in the next movie, but that's more of a problem with that one than this one. Overall, I think this is probably the best written MCU Spider-Man movie. It just isn't the best overall. But this movie doesn't really do anything wrong, so for all that, it comes up in number 14 on the list. Somehow, 16 years and nearly 50 projects later, Iron Man is still one of the best MCU projects. I'm gonna go ahead and say, Iron Man is one of the best superhero films of all time. It does the origin story concept probably third out of all superhero films, probably only behind Spider-Man 1 and Batman Begins. This film has one of the best casting decisions ever made with RDJ as Iron Man, as ever since 2008, whenever there's an adaptation of Iron Man, you bet it's taking heavy inspiration from Robert Downey Jr. Hell, even the comics are doing it now. And despite being 16 years old, this film still looks better than most modern day Marvel projects. This movie is just great on all ends, and it introduces the best qualities and some of the worst qualities of the MCU. And for all that, this movie ends up being number 13. Like a lot of projects on this list, up until recently, I would have said Captain America Civil War is not as good as people say it is. But upon my recent rewatch, something clicked in me, and yeah, it's as good as people say it is. Now, while I don't think it's top 10 material like a lot of people do, I still really like this movie. It does a good job of both feeling like Avengers 2.5, but never losing the fact that this is a Captain America movie, as he is undoubtedly the main character, and even though it is all that, it still manages to make it so that you can root for Iron Man. This movie also flawlessly introduces both Spider-Man and Black Panther, two characters who have since become fan favorites of the MCU, and it just does pretty much everything else well, as Zemo is obviously one of the best MCU villains. So, for all that, this movie comes in number 12. From one trilogy closer to another, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. This is a movie that manages to give every single character a good and proper send-off without a single character death. Even the main villain survives this movie, a first for the franchise. This movie has one of the best stories and one of the most emotional with Rocket's aspect, and one of the most evil villains with the High Evolutionary with one of the most satisfying and gruesome defeats. Put all that together, along with a great soundtrack as always, and this movie just barely misses out the top 10. But even still, I could go on for this movie for hours, but we've been here long enough as is. Now look at that, the third movie in a row as we have Thor Ragnarok. Now this film does everything that Thor and Love and Thunder did well, and does it 10 times better with pretty much no downside at all. This is one of the most funniest movies in the MCU, and for the most part, is still able to hit all of the serious notes. Now, while yes, it does kill off the Warriors 3 in a rather unceremonious fashion, aside from that little wrinkle, I really have no flaws with this movie. It is just a fun time. Finally a movie that isn't a third of a trilogy. Now, this is probably my hottest take, as I have said a lot in this video, but I think Avengers Age of Ultron is way better than the first one, and one of the best movies of the MCU. This movie does everything the first one did well, and does it better. All of the characters have more of their character in them, and it is able to both set up the downfall of the Avengers, but also have them work as a team. And this is the one movie where they are a team the whole way through. They're not forming together, they're not already apart. This movie, the Avengers are just the Avengers. Now, while Ultron may be a disappointment to some, if you change his name, he is an amazing villain. And this movie is one of the darkest movies in the MCU, and I really love it. I really don't have a lot of downsides with this movie, as I just think it does so much well. Into the last TV show on this list, I have Loki Season 1. This show, while it does have some dull moments, overall is just amazing. It manages to not only give its title character 3 movies worth of development through a montage of clips from the movies that he went through those developments in without feeling rushed. It introduces a bunch of fun new side characters who also get full arcs that are satisfying. This show is just full of shocking twists, has one of the best seasons finales of all of the Marvels on Disney+, and it manages to set up Kang, who, while apparently is being dropped, I actually really liked him in this. It also just looks better than pretty much any other Disney Plus TV show. So put all that together, and you get one hell of a good season. Next up, Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, I actually think this movie is written worse than Homecoming for reasons I'm sure that we all know about how the first hour doesn't really make a lot of sense and the setup is very poorly set up. But once you get to that bridge scene with Doc Ock, this movie just works. You forget about all the flaws from like the first hour or so and just are able to enjoy the nostalgia. This is a movie where nostalgia is done right. And I think we all know that. That's why we are all able to love it despite its weak first act. So, for that, it comes in at number 7. Next up, we have our newest thing in the MCU, Deadpool and Wolverine. Now, while this movie is really, really good, I'll say this. There's a reason this isn't called Deadpool 3. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into spoilers, but I will say, this doesn't really follow up on much plot threads from the first 2 Deadpool movies, and it really does feel like its own movie, with Wolverine as the co-star, as the marketing as advertised. But now, while Deadpool is heavily involved in the story, there are moments where it feels like he doesn't need to be there and is just really there to cheer on Wolverine, as most cheer moments in this movie are Wolverine related, as if you've seen the movie, I'm sure you know, and if you haven't, you'll find out once you see it. So overall, this is definitely one of the best things to come out of Marvel since the Infinity Saga, and is a great watch. And it has one of the best openings out of any Marvel movie, not just MCU, just Marvel in general. Seriously, go watch this movie. I know it's R-rated, so if that's the reason you haven't seen it because you're not 17, fair enough. But overall, I still really love this movie. I give it about a 9 out of 10 and place it number 6 on the list. Closing out the Disney Plus portion of this video is Loki Season 2. Now first off, everything good I said about Season 1 still goes here, but it doesn't have the issues that Season 1 of every TV show has, in that it doesn't have to deal with all the setup and introduction. It just jumps right in, and what story it jumps into is very fun and entertaining, and it develops a lot of twists and turns, and manages to give Loki yet another amazing send-off that manages to beat his one in Infinity War. So yeah, this show is just really good, and one of the best things Marvel has produced, and this season is the best thing Marvel has produced since the Infinity Saga has ended. Coming in at number 4, we have Guardians of the Freaking Galaxy. Now, this movie manages to introduce 5 brand new characters and manages to develop every single one of them. This movie has a very emotional story with a lot of good comedy, as all of these Guardians movies do, and this one just does it best. Star-Lord is by far at his best here, as he doesn't really have the unlikable qualities that he has in the later movies, Avengers movies included. The only bad thing I can say about this movie is the villain is rather one-dimensional, but I think that's the point. So, overall, this movie is just amazing and a great watch. And the best part about it, you don't need to have seen anything else in the MCU to understand it. So, if you have not seen this movie, but for some reason are watching this video, watch it. Okay, when I started making this list, I did not expect this movie to be high up. Well, I expected it to be high up, but not this high up. But upon making the list, I found myself thinking that Captain America the Winter Soldier is top 3 Marvel movies. This movie is an amazing masterclass of mixing both the superhero genre and the spy genre. It has amazing thrills and action sequences. Falcon is very good in this, and one of his best appearances in the MCU. This is the last time in the MCU where Nick Fury is important, and he's also a badass in it. This movie single-handedly managed to make Captain America cool and give him a bunch of new development, which he didn't get in his first 2 appearances, and manages to change the world of the MCU, with S.H.I.E.L.D. no longer existing by the end of it. When I started making this list, I knew what the top 2 slots were going to be, and in number 2, I have Avengers Infinity War. We all know why this film is great. It manages to balance having nearly 70 heroes in it without not feeling overstuffed. It has one of the best, if not the best, MCU villains, who is also the main character of this movie. All of the heroes in this movie, while not having their own individual arcs, do feel like themselves, and this has one of the best endings of any MCU movie, with Thanos winning. That's like the only time in the MCU where the villain actually wins and the heroes are defeated. That in and of itself would get it this spot, but the entire movie is so good from start to finish. And of course, by process of elimination, we have all found out that the number 1 movie of the MCU, at least in my opinion, is Avengers Endgame. It manages to be the perfect culmination of 11 years of movies. It is a masterful end to both Iron Man and Captain America, while still kinda setting up things to come, but serving as a finale in and of itself. We all know why this movie is good. We were all there when this movie came out, which is why it made nearly $3 billion. I don't need to sell you on this movie. We all know it's good. So that's why it comes in for me at number 1. But that's all for this video. This video was a monster to make. It took me so long. But this is also just my list. Comment down your list down below. And as always, be respectful. So, like, comment, share, subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Later, haters.